It was already past 11 when I found the note. It hadn't been there earlier, I was sure of it. I'd combed through the mail like I always did when I got home, the mundane mix of bills, advertisements, and junk. But now there it was, sitting alone on the kitchen counter as if it had been waiting for me all along. A single scrap of yellowed paper with shaky, handwritten words. Don't open the door after midnight. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse quickening with each passing second. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic. And though I tried to tell myself it was some kind of joke, the weight of the words settled in my chest like lead. I glanced at the clock, 11:18. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I didn't know why, but I locked the front door. Not just the deadbolt, but the chain latch, too. Then I checked the windows, pulling the curtains tight and testing the locks twice. It felt silly, but the note, there was something about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a prank. The first knock came at 11:43. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so soft that I almost missed it, like fingertips brushing against the wood. My stomach dropped. My immediate thought was that it had to be a neighbor, someone needing help or looking for something they'd lost. But then I remembered the note. I crept to the door, careful to avoid the creaky floorboard in the hall. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was on the other side could hear it. Peering through the peephole, I expected to see someone, a familiar face, maybe even no one at all. But there was only darkness. Not the streetlights from the yard, not the faint glow of the porch lamp, just an empty, black void. Another knock, this time louder. And then faintly, a voice. Please, I need help. It was a woman. Her voice was trembling, barely more than a whisper. My instincts screamed at me to open the door, to let her in, but then I glanced at the note still sitting on the counter. Don't open the door after midnight. I swallowed hard, backing away from the door. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaking. The silence stretched for so long I thought she might have gone. But then she spoke again, her tone more insistent. Please, I'm hurt. You have to let me in. I moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The air around it felt colder than it should, like a draft leaking in from somewhere unseen. I hesitated, then leaned back to look through the peephole again. This time there was something there. It wasn't a woman. The figure standing on my porch was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its face. I couldn't make out a face. The shadows seemed to shift and swirl where its features should have been, as though the darkness itself had taken form. My breath hitched in my throat and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. Let me in, it said, and now its voice was wrong. It still sounded like a woman, but the words dragged and stretched like a recording being played at the wrong speed. The clock on the wall read 11:57. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, the sound echoing through the house. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The knocks turned to bangs and then something heavier, a scraping like nails dragging across the door. Let me in, it repeated over and over, the voice splitting into layers, a chorus of whispers and screams. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the floorboards trembling beneath my feet. The clock struck midnight, and then silence. I stayed there, huddled on the floor, too terrified to move. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Slowly, I lifted my head and glanced at the door. The note was gone. And just beneath the doorframe, where the light from the hallway should have spilled out, there was a shadow. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just waited. For hours, I didn't move. The shadow under the door remained motionless, its edges faintly blurred like smoke. I thought about calling someone, but who? What could I even say? There's a shadow at my door that's not mine, and it's not leaving? No one would believe me. And deep down, I knew the moment I picked up the phone, something would change. That shadow would react. When the first rays of sunlight spilled through the curtains, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The shadow was gone. I crept toward the door, every step heavy with dread, and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, no evidence of what had happened the night before. Still, I didn't dare open the door. I busied myself the rest of the day, trying to push the memory of the knocking, the scraping, and that awful voice out of my mind. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and every creak of the house made me jump. Then I saw it. It was late afternoon, and I had finally convinced myself to sit down and watch TV. The static on the screen flared for a split second, and in the reflection of the darkened glass, I saw a shape, tall, skeletal, and leaning into the living room from the hallway. I spun around, my heart slamming into my ribs, but the space behind me was empty. The TV flickered again, the screen cutting to black for a moment, and in the reflection, it was closer. Just behind the couch now, looming over me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Do you see me now? The voice crawled out from behind me, low and guttural, layered with that same distorted echo I'd heard the night before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the room grew unbearably cold. I bolted. I ran upstairs, slamming the bedroom door shut behind me and locking it, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, listening for any sound outside. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, until, bang! The bedroom window rattled violently. I spun toward it, my stomach sinking. The curtains fluttered as though caught in a gust of wind, though the window was shut tight. The light from outside dimmed, the shadows pooling and twisting unnaturally. Something was moving outside. I inched closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the curtain. Pulling it back slowly, I peeked out and froze. It was standing in the yard right beneath the tree, the same tall, faceless figure I had seen through the peephole. Its head tilted up toward the window, but instead of a face, there was only a void, a swirling black mass that seemed to draw the light around it. I couldn't look away, even as nausea churned in my stomach. And then it raised a hand, long, thin fingers stretching toward me, and pointed. Not at the window. Not at me, at the front door. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. That was when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, like a dozen voices speaking in unison. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway. I pressed my ear to the bedroom door, straining to make out the words. They were muffled, distorted, but I could swear they were repeating the same phrase over and over again. Open the door. My knees buckled, and I slid to the floor. My hands clutched the sides of my head as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The house felt alive, pulsing with the rhythm of those words, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. I closed my eyes, rocking back and forth, trying to block it all out. But then everything stopped. The whispers, the rattling, even the pressure in the air. Silence fell over the house like a heavy blanket. I opened my eyes cautiously, glancing around the room. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, until I noticed the note. It was sitting on the nightstand, just as it had appeared on the kitchen counter the night before. But this time the message had changed. You opened it, now let me in. I couldn't breathe. I hadn't opened anything, had I? The front door was still locked, the windows untouched. But as I sat there staring at the note, I realized something. My bedroom door, the one I had locked just minutes ago, was now slightly ajar. And there was a shadow standing in the hallway. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, locked in place by the icy grip of terror. The shadow lingered in the doorway, tall and unnatural, its edges shifting like smoke. The faint light from the window barely touched it, as though the darkness it carried consumed everything around it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The door had been locked. I was sure of it. And yet here it was, ajar, and something was standing just beyond it. A single step echoed down the hallway. Then another. The sound was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate, as if it wanted me to hear each movement, to know it was coming closer. I scrambled backward, my hand fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. My fingers brushed against the switch, and the room was bathed in dim light. The shadow paused, retreating slightly, but it didn't vanish. It loomed just outside the threshold, waiting. Why are you doing this? My voice cracked, trembling with fear. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to it or to myself. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then it spoke. You opened the door. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the room like a low growl. It wasn't just one voice. It was a multitude, layered and distorted, as if every shadow in the house had found a way to speak. I stammered, my back pressed against the wall. I didn't open anything. The shadow moved closer, slipping into the room. It didn't walk. It glided, its form bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. The closer it came, the colder the air grew. I could see my breath now, misting in the dim light. You let me in, it whispered, the words curling around me like smoke. You read the note. You broke the seal. The note. My eyes darted toward it, still sitting on the nightstand. The edges of the paper seemed to writhe and curl as though alive, the words shifting beneath the surface. I didn't know what it meant, but somehow I had done exactly what it wanted. The shadow stopped just a few feet away. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it staring at me, its presence oppressive and suffocating. My chest tightened and my pulse thundered in my ears. What do you want from me? I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. To finish what was started. The words slid into my mind like a knife, sharp and cold. You opened the door. Now you must walk through. I shook my head violently, backing further into the corner. No, I didn't. My words caught in my throat as the shadow extended an impossibly long arm toward me, its fingers tapering into sharp, claw-like points. Before I could react, it touched the lamp on the nightstand, and the bulb exploded in a burst of glass and darkness. The room plunged into shadow, the only light now the faint glow of the moon through the window. And that's when I saw it. The shadow wasn't alone. Shapes began to materialize in the corners of the room, emerging from the walls and the floor. They were smaller but no less terrifying, their forms twisted and grotesque, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Their eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, fixed on me, unblinking. A cold hand gripped my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly, but there was nothing to fight against. The room was alive with movement now, the shadows closing in from every direction. Their whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of terror. "Walk through!" they chanted, the words pounding in my head like a drum. Walk through, walk through. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the nearest object, a heavy book from the nightstand, and swung it wildly. It passed through the shadows without resistance, and I realized with a sickening dread that there was no way to fight them. The bedroom door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I lunged for it, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My hands shook as I pounded against the wood, desperate for an escape. Behind me, the whispers stopped. I turned slowly, my back pressed against the door. The shadow, the first one, the tall one, was inches away now. Its clawed hand reached out, and I felt a chill seep into my chest, freezing me in place. "You can't run," it said, its voice a low hiss. "You belong to the darkness now." The shadows surged forward, engulfing me completely. The world disappeared, replaced by cold and silence. For a moment I thought it was over, that I was gone. But then I opened my eyes. I wasn't in the bedroom anymore. I was standing in front of the door. The door. It was massive, ancient, carved with symbols that pulsed with a dim red light. The air around it crackled with energy, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. This was the door I had opened without knowing. The door I had been warned about. And it was open. Just a crack. Something waited on the other side, a presence so vast and malevolent that I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me toward the threshold. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Walk through, walk through." I realized with growing horror that I didn't have a choice. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer to the door. As I reached the threshold, a single thought pierced through the fog of terror in my mind. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The pull from the door was irresistible, like gravity, dragging me toward the unknown. My feet scraped against the ground as I tried to resist, but it was pointless. The whispers had turned into a deafening roar, overlapping voices that drilled into my skull, each one promising pain, fear, and eternity in the dark. Walk through. The door creaked wider, its symbols flaring with crimson light that illuminated the void beyond. What waited on the other side wasn't just darkness, it was alive. A churning, endless abyss filled with grotesque shapes that twisted and writhed, their forms impossible to comprehend. The air was thick with the stench of rot and sulfur, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple like water. As I reached the threshold, a single clawed hand emerged from the abyss, its grotesque fingers curling around the edge of the door. It was followed by another, then a head without eyes, its mouth splitting open into a grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. "You're finally here," it rasped, its voice a blend of growls and hisses. "I've waited so long." I struggled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but the shadowy figures behind me pressed closer, their cold hands gripping my shoulders, my arms, my legs. They were pushing me forward, forcing me closer to the doorway. Desperation took over, and I screamed, "Why me? What do you want from me?" The creature's grin widened, its body pulling itself halfway through the door. "You were marked the moment you read the note," it said. "You became the key, and now you will be my doorway." The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about me, it was about letting it in. Whatever this thing was, it needed me to complete its crossing. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out, any way to stop it. And then I saw it. The symbols on the door. They weren't just glowing, they were shifting, rearranging themselves into something new. My eyes traced their movements, and suddenly I understood. The note hadn't just been a warning, it had been a set of instructions. A way to close the door. I had one chance. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I twisted in the shadow's grip and reached out for the edges of the door. The moment my hands touched the cold, ancient wood, pain seared through me, sharp and blinding. The creature roared, its claws lashing out and slicing into my arm, but I didn't let go. I focused on the symbols, forcing myself to trace them with trembling fingers. The air around me grew heavier, the whispers turning into agonized screams. The shadows clawed at me, trying to pull me away, but I held on, tracing the final symbol. A blinding light erupted from the door, flooding the room and forcing the shadows to retreat. The creature howled, its voice shaking the ground as it was dragged back into the abyss. Its claws scraped against the wood, leaving deep gouges as it tried to resist. "No!" it shrieked, its voice cracking with rage. "You can't stop me. I'll find another way." With a final burst of strength, I pushed the door shut, slamming it closed with a deafening boom. The air around me grew still, the whispers silenced. The symbols on the door faded, their light dimming until they disappeared completely. I collapsed to the ground, my chest heaving, the silence ringing in my ears. For a long moment, I didn't move. The house was quiet, the oppressive weight that had filled the air now gone. I was alive. But as I sat there, trembling and bleeding, I noticed something. The door wasn't entirely gone. A faint outline remained, etched into the wall where it had stood. It was dormant now, but the sight of it filled me with dread. The note had warned me not to open the door after midnight. I had closed it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The creature's final words echoed in my mind. "I'll find another way." And then I saw it. A new note sitting on the floor where the door had been. My blood ran cold as I picked it up, my hands shaking. "You closed it, but the door is never locked."